going to make a few introductory remarks regarding the itinerary of tonight and some conditions. First things first, we have a live stream, and because the live stream apparently is running through Spectrum's Wi-Fi, it'd be nice if everybody could log out of the Wi-Fi so the live stream is not interfered with. So if you're still connected to Spectrum's Wi-Fi, please log out of the Wi-Fi right now, because otherwise nobody's gonna be able to see this. That's the first thing. If you are watching the live stream, we have an Etherpad at which you can share your thoughts and questions that we will source the second part of the event from. You find the address of the Etherpad in the description of the live stream. So I'm not going to say that here. If you want to access the Etherpad from your mobile connection here, you can do that under medianpad.de/p/blockchainyourlife. medianpad.de/p/blockchainyourlife. Why is that interesting? That is interesting because the itinerary of tonight is going to look as follows. We're going to have 3 inputs of roughly 15 minutes each. We're going to hear inputs on the political and historical background of cryptocurrencies from Dennis. We're gonna hear some thoughts about the metaphysical implications and stakes involved in cryptocurrencies and cryptography from me. And we're going to hear a political perspective on crypto technology from Rose. What that's gonna look like, you'll see. After these inputs, we'll have a short break and source questions, and then we'll break up in, I guess, maybe 6 groups and discuss clusters of questions in these 6 groups so as to avoid the classical patriarchal situation of some authority talking down on the masses to be educated in a liberal fantasy of knowledge distribution, which never works. So we'll try and have discussions amongst ourselves, which we will then bring together in the end, once again, by the facilitators giving short 2-minute summaries of what happened in their discussions. If you are watching the live stream, you can have the discussion on the Etherpad. That's the idea. And we record the event, and you can then look at the Etherpad in the aftermath. So that's the way that we'll record and discuss, etc., etc. If everybody's okay with this itinerary, that makes me happy. If not, bad luck. Then I also want to thank, of course, Spectrum, especially Alfredo and Lika, who made this possible on a comparably short notice. Thank you so much. And I want to thank the speakers, Dennis and Rose, for being ready to have this little adventure with me. And I thank everybody who's here to accompany us. Then, did I forget anything super important? I don't think so. Then, without further ado, listen more closely.
No, we have also in the front bar more volume.
Yeah. Okay, in that case, everybody's ready. Everybody has attuned their ears to listening to fancy things being said. Everybody's ready for an hour of talks. Then, without further ado, here's Dennis Schep.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Luce. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Dennis. I'm not really a technology person. I mostly worked on literature in the past, but I guess my claim to some degree of competence in this space of cryptocurrency or digital ledger technology is a short text I wrote for the Archiv für Mediengeschichte. If people want to read that, I'll put it on ARC afterwards, called Politiek der Blockchain. I'm taking a very broad kind of political historical perspective. Yeah, I'll do that now as well. If we want to draw a diagram of what the industrial age looked like, it would probably be like a hub with spokes, right? It's an age of centralization. There was colonialism, which divided the world in metropolis and colony. There was urbanization, people moved to cities, making the countryside into a sort of like supply zone. Standardization of production, state-enforced education. So these are all centralizing tendencies, right? The digital age, especially with its dominant technology of the internet, is more like a decentral age. Of course, it didn't end centralizing movements of the age before, but if you want to draw, the internet is more like a mesh, at least in the beginning. More like a rhizome rather than a tree, if you want to throw in this Deleuzian terminology. Now, to counteract some of the enthusiasm that is often tied up with this, well, with the notion of the rhizome or with decentralization as such, I think it's kind of important to remember that the internet, or the DARPANet or ARPANET, when it was introduced, was really a military strategic invention, right? That came up in the Cold War. And the Cold War was a Cold War because both sides knew that if they attack, there's like mutually assured destruction. They would both be wiped out. Now, in the 60s, the United States, they got scared that maybe that mutually assured destruction wouldn't work out the way it was supposed to work out, because if Soviet Russia would strike a couple of like central points in the communications infrastructure, it would be impossible to coordinate the retaliation attack. So because of these considerations, they came up with this distributed network that would turn into the internet. And that's a network in which there's many, many nodes that communicate with each other, and you can take out a whole bunch of them, but there's no centralized point that you can take out to disable the entire network. So there's a clear military aim to decentralization as it emerged in that context. So the basic infrastructure of the internet as we know it is this distributed network, and it revolves around peer-to-peer communication. Now on top of that, over the years, especially with the rise of the World Wide Web, there's a secondary infrastructure that emerged, which revolves around client-server communication. That is, if you interact with Facebook or with Google, your computer sends a command to the Google server or the Facebook server, and you get information back. So that's a much more centralized model. Yeah, and so this centralization took over from the initial peer-to-peer architecture of the internet in a certain sense. And the reason is that certain things are just easier on a centralized network. It's easier to make money on a centralized network when there's one hub where all the information is stored and that can sell it for advertisements or whatever. It's also easier to implement censorship on a centralized model. It's easier to do state surveillance on a centralized model. There's a reason that Napster was taken down and that BitTorrent still exists, right? So this move from P2P to client-server is not just a technological move, it's also a very political and economically charged development. If you want to know more about that, I highly recommend the Telecommunist Manifesto, which I think is a very interesting text dealing with these things. So anyway, in the early days of the World Wide Web, in the 90s, there was this mailing list called the Cypherpunk mailing list, and I'm sure a lot of you know this. This is fairly basic stuff, but it's interesting to go over again. And that mailing list started in 1992. These people running it, they call themselves crypto-anarchists. They started writing manifestos, I think, in the late 80s. And if you read their manifestos, you'll see that for them, privacy and state surveillance, these are the main political battlegrounds. It's too loud? Okay. Sorry, I'm talking too fast. For them, the main political battlegrounds are privacy, state surveillance. These were for them the issues in the technological world. So that's what they were struggling with. Questions of distribution of wealth, questions of environment, of discrimination, these are secondary. Now, of course, if you're an activist, it's nice to not be subject to state surveillance, so it's all interconnected. But their focus is on these technologies of privacy, of cryptography. They were also a very practical group. They were writing code, working on cryptography. Julian Assange came out of that group, but also the people behind Tor, PGP, and this is the mailing list on which Bitcoin was introduced. That happened in an email, November 1st, 2008, by Satoshi Nakamoto, in which he referred to this white paper, right? Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. And there he just lays out how it works technologically, and Rose will go into that later, I think. I'm focusing on the political background here. Now, of course, we remember 2008, that was the year of the financial crisis, right? Like 2 months, or even less than 2 months before this email was circulated, the Lehman bankruptcy happened. And 2 weeks after that bankruptcy, the Fed basically printed $700 billion to inject into the banking system. Quantitative easing, which was a massive transfer of wealth from people to financial institutions. So this is the context in which Bitcoin was introduced and in which it gained some traction. And that context is, I think, also inscribed in the Bitcoin blockchain itself. You can put a little message on every block. And the Genesis block, which is the first block, which was mined in January 2009, it says, "The Times, 3rd of January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." So as a political technology, Bitcoin inscribed itself in the context of the crisis and was a protest against the central bank system. Satoshi talks about this on one of the bulletin boards of the P2P Foundation, and I quote, "The root problem with conventional currency is all the trust that's required to make it work. The central bank must be trusted not to debase the currency, but the history of fiat currencies is full of breaches of that trust. Banks must be trusted to hold our money and transfer it electronically, but they lend it out in waves of credit bubbles with barely a fraction in reserve. We have to trust them with our privacy, trust them not to let identity thieves drain our accounts. Their massive overhead costs make micropayments impossible." So this is the background, and these are the problems that Satoshi wanted to solve with his protocol. And I think you can see this in this passage already, that Bitcoin distinguished itself from the legacy central bank system in 3 or 4 ways. The first 2 are kind of together. The first is that it's a non-national currency, right? It's global, it's not subject to any jurisdiction. Most of the miners are in China now, but if China shuts down all of them, it will still exist, it will just go on. So that's the first point. Second point related to that is there's no possibility for intervention because code is law. So what the Fed did when Lehman went bankrupt is print $700 billion. Nobody can do that. The Bitcoin protocol prescribes how new Bitcoin enters into circulation, and nobody can change that. Now, to somehow underline the political ambiguity of this, I would like to say that this is basically Milton Friedman's wet dream also, right? People like liberal theories of liberalism, have always operated with the opposition of state and market, and always claimed that the power of the state should be limited so that the market can basically do its work. It's more efficient. This is the invisible hand line of thought. Now, in practice, liberalism doesn't really function that way, right? The state ends up guaranteeing the functioning of the market, and it props it up when necessary by printing money sometimes. So, in a sense, you can read the introduction of this new technology as like a straight-edge liberalist corrective of state interventionism. Yeah. So that was the second point, no intervention. The third point is that Bitcoin is designed for deflation rather than for 2% inflation, which is basically the aim of central banks in most of the world, or the whole world maybe. The fact that it's about deflation also, of course, leads to hoarding, right? People don't spend it because they know it will increase in value, or they assume it will, making it an asset rather than a currency. And people compare it to gold, and even the people working on Bitcoin right now, they call it like a store of value because well, the system is also kind of fucked up technologically right now, so you cannot really use it as a currency. But so yeah, it became an asset or a speculative instrument in a certain sense, which has to do with this deflation. And the fourth point is, I think it's impossible to set up a fractional reserve system on the basis of Bitcoin. The fractional reserve means that even private banks, even not just central banks, but private banks too, they can create money. They're allowed to lend out more money than they have. There's a certain ratio that they have to sustain, but nobody knows how much dollar or euros there is in circulation, right? Because these private institutions, they lend out more than they have, creating new money in effect. With Bitcoin, you can always know how much there is, maximum. And in that sense, it's more like cash rather than like the digital money that circulates on the financial markets. So there's these 4 points, right? It's global, no interventionism, designed for deflation, no fractional reserve system. Now, despite the kind of problems I lined out, I do think there's something really appealing about this vision. I also think that in its development, perhaps Bitcoin is deviating from the kind of political origin that it sprang from. Of course, it just became a speculative instrument nowadays, right? Mostly also a hedge against the dollar, I think. A lot of people don't believe, or they believe that the dollar is going to crash, so they put money in Bitcoin. But Bitcoin is also the first implementation of blockchain technology. There's thousands of cryptocurrencies right now, and many of them have nothing to do with this cypherpunk ethos. It's really about increasing efficiency and putting forward new economic models. Even something like micropayments, which does figure in the original proposal by Satoshi, I think there can be something scary about it, right? And you see this in the Ethereum ecosystem, for example, where, I mean, there's people working on stuff like Golem or Storj, which is basically an Airbnb for computer space or for processing power. You can rent out your excess processing power and you get paid in micropayments. But if these things are subject to financial incentives, that means financial incentives have more of a grasp on our daily life than it has now. And there's many projects like this that become possible because of the lowering of overhead costs through micropayments. And replacing every incentive with a financial incentive is also a sort of neoliberal fantasy, but which, I mean, I think that's one dark kind of horizon or scary horizon of this space. It's not the only thing the space does, obviously. You cannot reduce it to a single political aim, I think. And finally, I mentioned already that the central political aim of this cypherpunk community was really, it was about privacy, state surveillance, that kind of stuff. Wealth distribution is very secondary to them. And well, wealth distribution in the cryptocurrency space is of course a bit problematic. I mean, it probably privileges like techno-savvy white guys mostly, but now there's also these proof-of-stake coins where you basically get an annual dividend, which is basically ownership of the means of production. And I mean, in terms of distributions, there's a lot of issues in that space. With all that in mind, I think we can just, which is questions I hope to discuss later, we can ask whether blockchain will realize the real decentralized potential of the internet, as some people claim, or whether it just will streamline business and lead to a world in which monetary policy is run by corporations rather than by central banks, and in which our life is even more governed by financial incentives than it already is. And of course we know that capitalism is an assimilation machine, right? It always tries to take its outside and put it inside. I do think there's something subversive about blockchain technology, and there's a lot of revolutionary rhetoric surrounding it. But I also think the space really lends itself to this assimilation. But I hope to discuss that later. Thank you.
I just thought maybe you wanted to comment on that. Thank you. So I thought I should start out. Okay, introduction. I would actually love to talk about politics, but I agreed to chained myself to talk about metaphysics and the metaphysical foundations of cryptocurrencies and cryptography and blockchains, because I thought that if we want to have an actual conversation about these things, it might make sense to have some background. So I thought I'd start with the question, why ask a philosopher about this? Like, what would philosophy have to say in general? Because that might not be clear. And so I came to think that I should start by saying a little bit about philosophy and problems in general. So when people ask me what philosophy does, I sometimes say philosophy is like the troublemaker of the sciences. Philosophy is the discipline, as it were, that makes problems, that tells you that you have problems that you didn't know you were having. So the fundamental question of philosophy is really, what's your problem? And one of the largest problems, of course, always is that people find solutions for things that they don't know what the problem is of. That they're finding solutions for problems that are not well analyzed. So one of the questions of philosophy is, what's the problem? So what I'm going to try and do is to formulate a problem. I'm not going to try to give any answers. I'm going to try and formulate a problem. And it is not without interest that down this alley, philosophy has a lot to do with computation, insofar as algorithms are also sets of instructions which must satisfy certain conditions in order to solve problems. So the classical definition of an algorithm would be this procedure solves this problem, and then the study of algorithms is can this problem in general be solved in finitely many steps? So, and I will come back to this interesting isomorphism or parallelism between philosophy and computation on that level. But let me first try and distinguish two kinds of languages. And then, so I will first try and distinguish two kinds of languages, and from this distinction of languages, I will try and show you a certain metaphysical problem that has played out hugely in the 20th century, especially, that has to do with reference, recursion, and what some people call the metaphysics of presence. I will try and show how financial crises are inevitably hardwired into the way that value works in a referential system. From this, I will try and take a look at cryptocurrencies as currencies that work on another, or that pretend, that claim to work on another kind of language, so to speak, which is not referential. And then in the end, I'm going to try and say a few things about what that might mean for thinking, how we can think about cryptocurrencies. And that might be the question that I'm trying to formulate, right? Like, how are we to think about cryptocurrencies? But we need a certain background in order to understand that this is an actually interesting question, or complicated question. Okay, so we might distinguish two kinds of languages. So I'm drawing here from DuPont and Nelson Goodman. So you might want to distinguish two kinds of languages, and that is referential languages and ordering languages. Referential languages are, for example, like what we call natural languages. So we think that the words that I'm using are referring in some way to actual things, right? So this is the microphone. A microphone is a phallic object of power because of the microphone, etc. So I can make all this all this analysis. Ordering languages work in a different way from referential languages in that the reference of the ordering language is of no importance. Ordering languages are languages that are purely manipulation of signs, of elements. So I'm now, of course, speaking in referential languages, but the idea of coding, for example, is not that the code refers to something in the world, but that certain elements are manipulated so as to bring about a certain effect. This is an idea that was conceived, or that is generally attributed to Leibniz, 17th century, and then has been largely developed and made a huge jump in 19th century with the conception of mathematical logic and led to the whole mathematization of everything that we know as a life world. So we have referential languages, reference to actual things, ordering languages, manipulation of elements so as to bring about an effect. Okay. So now there are serious problems with referential languages, and these problems with referential languages have to do with problems of recursion. And I'd like to give you two brief examples, and the one is the one of writing, and the other one is the one of value. I want to talk briefly about writing because we also need to talk about cryptography, and cryptography is grapheme is a kind of writing. So we are about to make a distinction between two different kinds of writing. And I want to talk about value because cryptocurrency seems to be the currency kind that is embarked upon by crypto writing, cryptography. Okay. So in order to understand what it means, like what the metaphysical impact of cryptocurrency might be, it might make sense to understand what value is and what writing is in a referential system. So in a referential system, so referential writing, so to speak, would be the signification of signification. This is basically drawing from Jacques Derrida, grammatology, and all of these kinds of things, right? So the classical philosophical idea of writing is signification of signification. Now the problem is that once the signifier can signify another signifier, there's no real reason why this signifier shouldn't signify even another signifier, and another signifier, and another signifier ad infinitum. So you're having what Derrida would call the necessary possibility of an infinite regress of signification, where the idea that something is actually signified, I'm holding a microphone in my hand, which is a phallic object of power, is nearly an effect, right? It's an act of violence, if you want to. It's an arbitrary cut of the significatory chain. Now, this becomes a problem in the age of secularization, because the classical idea, there is an end to the chain, and we have a name for it. It's called God. Loses its currency, right? It's not attractive anymore. So people try to find other foundations for all of their systems, and most of them are recursive. The Descartesian cogito, the Kantian unity of apperception, the Hegelian spirit, all of these things. These are all recursive figures. And one of the things that has been shown in the 20th century over and over again is that all of these models run into significant trouble. Gödel's undecidability theorem, difference, all of these things. I mean, I'm just putting this out there. I could prove this. We can do this in conversation if you want to. But it always works in a way, as I have described it, in a very simple sense, right? The signification of signification of signification brings about the necessary possibility of an infinite chain of signification, which then doesn't find an end to the thing. And scarily, this also works in the case of value. And I'm going to take maybe Marx for the moment. So use value and exchange value, and the use value would be the suitability of a certain thing to solve a problem. Surprise. Okay, so use value would be the suitability of a thing to solve a certain problem. So what then would exchange value be? So ordinarily, we would make a very complicated argument about how exchange value is grounded in labor and all of these things. So, and we would end up with a definition of exchange value, which is the relation of several use values to each other. But interestingly, you can get by making a recursive definition and saying the exchange value is the use value of use value. So if I use the use value, the suitability to solve a problem itself, this usability itself, I enter a realm of relations between various use values, and that is effectively exchange value. And if this exchange value is expressed in a common denominator, we call it a price. That's money in for marks. Okay. Now the problem, of course, is that that there's no necessary relation anymore in the definition of the exchange value to the actual usability, because we have defined it over a potential. It's the suitability. Nobody knows if it really suits you. Nobody knows if this microphone is really going to grab me the other. I just need to trust in it. That's why where the trust problem comes in. In order to keep together the exchange value and the use value, I need to just pretend that it's doing that. And this is, so to speak, the gateway for speculation. So trust is needed, and trust can be exploited, and that is speculation. And that means that the question of speculation, and that means financial crisis in the end, over speculation, over exploitation of speculation, excess of value, is, as it were, hardwired into the concept of value as a referential system. System of writing and a referential system of value, and they both generate a necessary possibility of infinite regress, which manifests in the question of value, like the referential value, as financial crisis. Okay. So now, but we just distinguish two different kinds of languages, which is referential languages and ordering languages. And I would think that in the moment that the Bitcoin white paper comes up and says, we need to do away with trust, this is exactly what is tackled, so to speak. This linkage and the leakage between exchange and use. And I'm going to, oops, sorry. I'm going to read a second from my notes. Writing in general, value in general. Right. Okay, so ordinary money or value in general is ear of the metaphysics of presence. The metaphysics of presence is the continuous denial and the catastrophe that comes about with the denial of the possibility of this regress. It bears on signification and its inevitable failure. Okay, what then about cryptocurrencies? First, it is important to note a step that has oftentimes been omitted, and that step is that of course, before cryptocurrencies, money has already, or like our currencies have already changed from the analogous flow of physical tokens and like bookmaking, as in like real books, into another stage, which happened throughout the 90s and 2000s when money became computerized in stock exchanges, in banking, in international, transnational banking systems, etc., etc. So at this moment already, we pretend that we're using a referential system of value, but in fact, we are using an ordering system of value, meaning value being stored in computerized languages. But we still pretend that we're using another thing. So what I think is, what then happens 2008, 2009, as Dennis mentioned, is that it seems that that this idea of a trust of these two kinds of values gets a serious blow, and that leads apparently to the idea that we could circumvent the question of value. Quoting Nakamoto, what is needed is an electronic system based on cryptographic proof instead of trust. We're replacing proof for trust. And in Bitcoin, for example, that right, okay, so cryptocurrencies turn smart currencies inside out. So smart currencies would be, we pretend that it's a referential system, but really it's not. In the latter, the content, if you will, was an ordering language, while the form kept faking representative relations. Cryptocurrencies invert this relation. Now the form is that of manipulatable units, namely code. But mutatis mutandis, the content is also code, now faking referentiality. That is because the form of smart money had been code all along, while the slight catch that nobody really acknowledged that. Turning smart money inside out, turning it into cryptocurrency, hence merely means to acknowledge what had long been true: money is code, code is money. What then is the question? So the question that I meant to formulate, and that's where I'll end for the moment, and then we can continue and discuss some of this later, is that so in this itinerary, like in this trajectory that I tried to show, cryptocurrency tries to solve a problem that comes about with referential languages, which is, where do we cut the infinite regress? Where do we cut the sequence? And the solution here seems to be to transpose the whole thing into a completely different system, which is ordering languages. And the referential system, I would think, emerges from the problem of what some people call the death of God. So God would traditionally vouch for the world to work in a certain way. And then different other horses that you can bet on, like the gold standard, like the body of the king, etc., would take that place, and none of these work. So the question then, if we understand that this problem emerges from a theological problem, really, where's the end of the line? What is the divine element? Is how to come up with an atheist currency. A currency not referring back to some sequel of a divine entity. And does cryptocurrency do that? And I don't think it does. And I think we'll hear more about why it does not do that. But I think one of the reasons for it to not do that is that the trust issue is merely outsourced, as it is always in capitalistic systems. So we're working on externalities. We're like outsourcing the problem to the weakest possible player, so to speak, user, which is then the singular person. I forgot to talk about failure. I need to do that later. So one point about failure, because Rose is going to talk about undo buttons. So if you remember the infinite regress problem, there are reasons for us to think that failure and mistakes are really not signifying something which is not the case, which would bring us into a contradiction. So the sentence, Dennis is talking, is false, but does not reference Dennis who's not talking, but references something else. So if it would reference Dennis who's not talking, then we would enter in a regress, a contradiction. So the idea is to conceptualize mistake as a deflection rather than referencing something which is not. And that then means that the infinite regress itself becomes the manifestation of failure, because we're like deflecting from one unit to the other, signification of signification, exchange value, more exchange value, etc., etc. So in the referential system, at least, we can say that failure is inevitable because of the necessary possibility of infinite regress and the definition of failure as deflection. That's the point about failure.
Okay, so looking a little bit more directly at some of the politics surrounding blockchains and cryptocurrencies, for me, the first necessary point would be to set a base understanding of what blockchain means, because to me, the understanding the material reality is ultimately a huge aspect of power relations, which is the basis of politics. So the blockchain can be understood as a persistent, transparent, public, append-only ledger. And what that means is that it's basically a record book that sticks around. Everybody can see the transactions of, because it is public and transparent, and there is no going back and changing things. There is only adding new lines. So that's a lovely abstract description. What the blockchain actually is a series of chunks of information. So it starts with the Genesis block, which Dennis mentioned, and that's the first block. And in that block, there is the introductory message, and then transactions and a hash of those transactions. Each following block contains a hash of the previous block, transactions, and then a hash of the full block. And in that way, because each block refers to the previous block, you can observe an unbroken chain of agreement. Now, with the blockchain, one of the things that is going on with it that makes it decentralized and leads to its appeal in the context of cryptocurrency is that many different people are simultaneously holding copies of it and are kind of competing for who is awarded ownership and definitive record of the creation of the next block. And how that works is that they have a mechanism for deciding through consensus. And if any of you have worked with consensus in the past, you can probably recognize that there is a considerable amount of overhead, shall we say, and that it is frequently far more time and labor intensive than either simple majority rules voting or having like one dictator in a group who decides everything. So basically what happens is that the trust is shifted with this mechanism for coming to agreement with the blockchain. The trust is shifted from trusting each person or entity who is working on the blockchain to instead placing that trust in the mechanism for checking the consensus between the blocks. Part of how that works with, for instance, the Bitcoin version of the blockchain is through what is called proof of work. And this is making the process of hashing each block, slightly more labor-intensive computationally, which kind of slows down the rate at which someone can complete a block. So I keep mentioning hashing, and I haven't defined it. Hashing is a algorithmic or mathematical process by which you take a large chunk of information and you run it through an algorithm or an equation, and then you receive a set length, what to us appears random string of digits and numbers. And the way that the math works on that is that it is kind of like a shortcut way of sort of fingerprinting a large amount of data. And the hash will be effectively unique on a given block of data. So as we've moved away from Bitcoin into other cryptocurrencies, we've seen a shift from that model of kind of a rate slowing on the ability to hash and therefore claim the next block, which is referred to as proof of, where the way that the definitive authorship of the next block then is solidified comes from a combination of a certain amount of random selection and then a weighting of stake in the process. And that can be done either through who has more of whatever coins or tokens are determining the amount of stake, or through the age of the tokens that are determining that stake. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's fairly each block is followed by another block. But that isn't strictly speaking true. There's also something called a side chain where you can have people sort of branch off in another direction, and that can happen for many different reasons, and it's built into some algorithms. But for the most part, when we refer to a blockchain, we're talking about a progression from one block to the next block to the next block to the next block, which means that it's continuously growing. Sidechains allow an option that means that you can decrease or limit the speed at which the size of the blockchain grows, but there is no way at this point to have a set size blockchain, which means it will become more and more costly and cumbersome as time goes on. Specifically, as you may have heard, possibly back in December, possibly earlier, from the perspective of electricity consumption. There have been many numbers floated around. Sometimes the amount of electricity used for processing the blockchain and mining Bitcoin specifically is referred to as more electricity than Ireland. I decided not to go into exact numbers and figures because unless you are an electrical power engineer who specializes in large-scale transmission, it's fairly meaningless. It's also not as easy to come up with definitive numbers on many of these issues as we might like. And so rather than confuse the situation, I decided to keep it a little bit more general. So you have a huge amount of electricity consumption going into this, but there's no consensus on how much. And this has been a known potential problem or actual problem since at least 2013, where you had coverage in Bloomberg, of all places, which is not known for its cutting edge fringe technology politics coverage, shall we say. So this has been an inevitable issue with blockchains and Bitcoin especially. Beyond the electricity issue, there's another issue, which is the components being used for cryptocurrency mining and maintenance of the blockchain. So shortly after this 2013 article, there were a number of articles on the footprint of iPhones. It became very popular to cover for a certain amount of time, and those articles tended to focus on two things. One was the environmental impact, and that has to do with the issues with extractive industries and how dirty they tend to be, and that we have not solved our e-waste problems. So every time you buy a new phone or every time you buy new computer components, including for cryptocurrency mining setups, you are discarding other items that are incredibly toxic, and we do not have processing structures in place for. But then with iPhones, there was also the additional consideration of the use of cobalt in the batteries, which is of particular interest because of the use of slave labor in Congo for the mining. And while cryptocurrency setups do not tend to have large battery banks because they don't need to and battery banks are expensive, they are still using a tremendous amount of hardware that requires many, many different components, some of which come from extractive industries, which, while not being cobalt per se, are tremendously, tremendously bad for the environment, as well as having, in general, a horrible track record on labor conditions. And that also is true for the manufacturing of computer components. So besides the dehumanization in the labor processes and kind of the supply chain of cryptocurrencies and the blockchain, there's some, in my opinion, structural dehumanization of financial transactions that the blockchain and cryptocurrencies put in place. So first, the blockchain creates this permanent public record, essentially. And while there are cryptocurrencies that are striving for privacy and anonymity, it is worth noting that Bitcoin is not anonymous in the least. It is potentially pseudonymous, but what that means is it is possible to go back through and to analyze the blockchain and really understand where money is flowing and to draw a lot of conclusions from that as to what is the nature of the transaction and potentially the identities of people involved with the transactions. And I think when you remove that kind of, or when you put that kind of information out there, it is highly unlikely that that will benefit people, and very likely that it will be used as a means of gaining knowledge and power and, in the end, control over people's lives, although potentially in subtle ways, still in meaningful ways. So there's also, within the blockchain, the lack of an undo button. There is no, oops, I made a mistake, Control Z. There's nothing for that, and that plays out in a few different ways. So one, it means that if you are the victim of fraud or theft, there's no recompense. There's no getting your stuff back. When we have credit card transactions and there's credit card fraud, you file a complaint with your credit card company, and ultimately what generally ends up happening is you get your money back, and the merchant who received the fraudulent transaction, they foot the bill. With cryptocurrency, the end user foots the bill. And part of why this matters is that we all make mistakes. And the dominant narrative it better, or why didn't you double check the address that is completely nonsensical and many, many characters long that you typed in or copy pasted or however to facilitate that transaction. So we've mostly talked about cryptocurrencies, but another use of blockchains are smart contracts. And smart contracts are basically coded contracts, like computer coded contracts that you set up conditions, and when certain conditions are hit, other transactions will happen. And with smart contracts, there are many ways you can have certain kinds of checks and balances in them, but you don't effectively have a check and balance on the entire contract. So this can be incredibly appealing if you are if you believe that your contract is perfect, but the moment that your contract becomes imperfect, it becomes highly problematic. Beyond which, when you have a smart contract, you lose the ability to have forgiveness. And so one potential use of smart contracts is related to loans and debts and debt repayment. And this means that we lose the ability to erase mistakes that are financial in nature. And we shift what little power we have. So to me, especially looking at the smart contract, while some of this technology is interesting and has some potential uses, ultimately what we need is to find and solve better problems. So micropayments were referenced, but micropayments are utterly infeasible with Bitcoin at this point, because the transaction cost alone is too high to be a microtransaction. The problem isn't the enforcement of the contract, it's everything surrounding it. They've solved a non-problem to a certain extent and claimed that they've solved a much, much larger problem. And there's also this myth that goes along with it that there is no middleman and that we've gotten rid of banks with this beautiful, amazing thing. And instead, you have the creation of a new middleman of the blockchain. And so in all of this, it's important to really understand your problem space and to recognize what you are or are not addressing a little bit more thoroughly.
Thanks everybody for the first part of this event. We'll take a 10-minute break in which you are all recommended, during which I recommend all of you to buy lots of drinks from the bar so as to facilitate more events. And we'll start with the second part of the event in about 10 minutes. Thank you.
The current available cryptocurrencies. What are the kinds of problems that we would like to see addressed by new and creative financial, like fintech solutions or not fintech financial technology solutions?
Yeah, I thought we could discuss the ways in which cryptocurrencies are effectively just reinforcing systems that we see under capitalism. So how they're actually reinforcing dynamics that are already in place, but also maybe to ask how we could build things to kind of counteract this kind of Milton Friedman wet dream. So for example, could you build a cryptocurrency that has a redistributive mechanism built into it?
So my question is a question that I have myself, which is, if you have a technology that's decentralized, and public, you would think that's a liberatory form, but how is it not liberatory? Like, it's a liberatory technological form, but how is it not liberatory socially or economically? And I think that's something I'm interested in talking about.
Dialectics or contradictions, I think, between how much we can use these kind of networked-based, emergent things, and to which extent they are assimilated. And I would be interested first in the subjects, if we can use this word, like who is doing that at the moment? I would be really interested to see if it's a cyberpunk movement and who is actually right now involved in this, because I think it's also interesting to trace back to whose interests are now served at the moment with that. So if you would, if you would help me in that, you're welcome.
And I think I'd like to discuss, I mean, like I spent so much time like articulating a question, so now I want to discuss it. So I'm going to discuss whether or not cryptocurrencies are an atheist currency in the sense that they get out of the problem of infinite regress that I tried to depict, and it's secular, or like it's post-secularity. So the question would be: is cryptocurrency a post-secular or an atheist currency? That's the question. Okay, these are two very different things. Maybe Dennis stays here. I don't have them. So the questions were, what can be solved and what cannot be solved? The question was, what is the liberatory potential of cryptocurrencies? Cui bono? Who benefits? Classical Marxist question. Oh yeah, the reproduction of existing dynamics.
What would be better problems to solve?
Oh yeah, what are the better problems? So what would be the better problems to solve? What is reproduced? What can it solve in its current setup? Who benefits? What is the liberatory potential? Or the not liberatory potential? Liberation. And post-secularism versus atheism. Well, it all refers to cryptocurrencies, it's true. We need a spatial distribution. If you want to discuss something else,
It's kind of open anyway, you know?
it's open anyway. Dennis stays here. Rose maybe in that corner. Ishan maybe is by the sofas. Marga is by the bar. And you're in the middle? Yeah? And I'll stay here for a second. See you in 45 minutes.
That's too long.
Wait, la 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 la, ha 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 ha. So although nobody's listening, I would like to wrap this up. But apparently nobody cares really about wrapping this up. You know, if people want to talk on forever, that's fine. I don't care. I think the speaker's off.
It's on. It's actually on, but it's very, 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 very low. Maybe on the amplifier.
Maybe.
Is the amplifier on the other side?
I think we're just... Are you okay? You look exhausted. Did you have fun? Hm? Ich dachte, wir machen jetzt noch so einen eigenen Frage. Vielleicht so Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, kings and queens and queers and children, I'm happy that you all stayed with us and that you're all apparently so enthusiastic about talking about cryptocurrencies and blockchains that you are in unmanageable. That's good. It's a decentralized, unmanageable mass of peer-to-peer conversations. We thought that we'd have small synopses of what happened in the discussions, and then we'll disperse. Probably we're gonna go and have drinks and stuff. So you're welcome to stick with us. And I'm not sure when they're gonna close this place down, but we're happy to continue the conversations. We just thought it might be nice to like wrap things up and then go into the rest of the evening. Rose's gonna start.
This is what I get for taking notes and being prepared, or looking like I'm prepared. There is a difference. Okay, so we talked about, I guess, decision-making and voting, microtransactions, forgiveness, what happens when you can't pay debt, contracts with built-in mandatory mediation, the hypocrisy of nations, different discussions needed for people versus nation-states, that scale is maybe crucial for framing currency discussions, scale in terms of like how much it exists, but also scale in terms of the like geographic scope or what portion of the world population you might be wanting to reach. The potential for optimizing for other things besides profit, specifically ecological sustainability, co-ops versus cryptocurrency movements, and how they're both trying to kind of address this problem of what is lacking from centralized structures, but that they're doing it in completely different directions. A question of, are cryptocurrencies meant to even try to kill capitalism? Why are we trying to avoid trust and getting hurt? And maybe a bunch of terminology could be better done, such as not using the word contracts when that's not quite what we're exactly talking about relating to smart contracts.
Yeah, our discussion was a little bit all over the place, I think, but one of the things that we think blockchain does make possible is moving large amounts of money across borders without being noticed. The questions of questions of identity managers, we talked about that. We talked about voting on the blockchain. We talked about getting away from the Facebook monopoly on identity management in digital environments. We talked about whether artificial intelligence can live on chain and the implications of that. We talked about proprietary registers, and in the end it went a bit all over the place, not so much about what it can and cannot do, but whether it facilitates innovations or stultifies it. You were very much defending the view that it does facilitate innovation environments that have limited access to financial infrastructures. I'm perhaps a bit more critical. And I think one interesting point that we talked about without reaching a clear conclusion, obviously, is the opposition of inflationary and deflationary currencies, and whether, central banks impose inflation or try to go for inflation, whether it's possible to envision an economy that functions on the basis of a deflationary currency, which is way over my head from an economy perspective, but that's something we did talk about for a bit. Is there anything you want to add, or that's?
We found that there were certain positive things about the in comparison to an inflationary system or the central bank system that we live in.
You did mention that also this project called Circle, which is basically basic income organized through a blockchain. I didn't know this project, but like it is possible to program blockchains that are less about like speculating, but more about actually questions of redistribution. That is technically possible, which is.
Most of them are not basically like looking for speculation.
Yeah. Well.
But,
Anyway, so that was, I think, it.
We have a group, we have a small group response. Okay. Where is everyone? Who wants to start? Sorry? Yeah, I think everyone's here. Okay.
So, my statement is that I cannot eat my code unless it's become garlic naan.
Yeah, my statement or question was that with cryptocurrencies and blockchain, we are building a decentralized system which gives us some kind of power, the power of the network, but the surveillance can be a backlash. And how do we deal with that? We discussed this.
My question remains, or is still, a push to find the original source of our referencing power, because we keep, going further and further towards this necessary possibility of regress, and I think that it's unhelpful in a way, and maybe that we should go back to the start and figure out what that standard was, what that value standard was, and
alternative to trust, or systems built on trust? Is there an alternative?
Am I finishing? Okay. My question is pretty simple, pretty short, and it's how will my grandparents join this?
My question was just in relation to distinguishing cryptocurrency from financial institutions, and just one of the observations that I kind of got from it was to what extent cryptocurrencies are it just takes the agency out of it. It's difficult to actually discern who is behind the transactions or whatever it may be.
I didn't really come up with a statement, but maybe I'll say something that you were talking about, which was do we want a process or a form that doesn't allow changes to be made, because being able to change something can be beneficial to a system?
Well, my one would be, told you I'm a terrible public speaker. My one would be the creators of cryptocurrencies. Of course, they have motives, but do they have also ulterior motives once they begin creating this currency?
Thank you.
Dynamics Adora point that sometimes people just like to see a transfer of power, even if the structure of power remains the same. We then, well, I mean, the reasons for that were sort of things like the basis of our lives are already capitalism, and cryptocurrencies are still like taking place within that framework. They've not totally disrupted it, so people who already have a lot of wealth and power are already in a position to buy up large parts of this infrastructure and so on. Not to mention the fact that like cryptocurrencies themselves are not inherently like the protocols that we see at the moment are often based on quite capitalistic assumptions. We then moved on and discussed some sort of more concrete examples. So we heard about the Estonian government's use of blockchain and sort of putting citizens' public records on a kind of public ledger, which in some ways seems maybe like a kind of benevolent state, making things more transparent. And there's some very interesting discussion about the role or like the popularity that cryptocurrencies have taken on in post-communist countries. I think particularly in Russia, where kind of, although there's been this sort of shock doctrine in capitalism that's kind of failed to deliver a utopia, there is still in the crypto community, there is still a kind of belief in kind of libertarian capitalism as a freedom from still very controlling state entities. Did you want to add anything to that? Okay. Oh yeah, and we also had the thought that maybe we won't actually arrive at any kind of utopia until we abolish money and property. So, yeah.
Okay, we were a very small group. There was no one of us was expert, so the discussion was very concrete and it was very good. It was so concrete, it was very funny as well. So we started with this question, and it was my question because I remember myself, I've been an activist for the Greek crisis, etc., and I remember myself sitting in panels with people talking about bitcoins after the crisis 2010, 2011, and being very, very affirmative about it. So I was in panels with those people, and back then I was like, oh, these male nerds, you know, talking about some technical stuff. And now I find myself, you know, this Bitcoin thing being much more worth than gold. And I think, like, how did I lose the number of this guy, you know? I should, you know who it was, because he was talking as if he's actually one of the creators of it back then. And I have still activist friends who know these people and tell me, yes, but they use their profit and they distribute it into political activism. So this is, you know, one of the arguments that is around, that the people that initially created it actually do some philanthropic work with it, which is not political, but is a philanthropic word. So I was like, who are these people now? And then we were just putting together the users. So there was the state of Venezuela, for example, started to create something like a Bitcoin in order to be independent from financial markets, which me, as a Greek person who has the state, not the state. People, yes. So it's a possibility, you know, to get independent from financial markets. You know, like, at least it is used like this. We talked about Barcelona and Común that used bitcoins and gave it to refugees, people that had found refuge, in order to go to the supermarkets and buy something with it. But the trick about it is that you can control what the refugees buy. So refugees cannot buy alcohol, or I don't know, heroin, but something's in the supermarket, right? So it's a regulated way to distribute money. Migrant and migration, it's used organizing financial conferences. Is more quick, is less expensive, etc. So they're using it a lot. But also now states want to regulate it. They try to tax it. China banned the exchange of it, to exchange with Bitcoin, and Bali completely illegalized Bitcoin. So although we have a decentralized structure, more and more the regulations come from states. Then we thought, if you have a quantum computer, you could create noise. You know, you can read these things, apparently, the blockchains, and you can create noise, and you could have a subversive sabotage to this currency like this, or maybe states can do new financial wars to each other by, you know, sabotaging with quantum computers. Then we thought, how can it be transformed to real life, to something that is good for us, and how we could use it, for example, in composition to basic income. So how an idea of basic income could be bound to cryptocurrency. But at the moment with Bitcoins, we said you cannot pay small amounts. You only can pay big amounts, which is not so much good for the everyday. We said that the distribution of wealth is not touched by it, that if you have wealth, you can buy a lot of Bitcoins and get rich. If you euros. And then we came to the question that was also already asked, is who's behind the creation of it? That is so untransparent, right? And because we were talking about trust, is like, how can we trust something that is so untransparent? Talking about that is more and more abstract, you know? And this trust is actually even more absurd than in financial markets. So we talked about who's behind it and who regulates it. Because at the moment it is regulated by the invisible hand. And that they are regulated by local assemblies. So people come together and they decide about how they're going to use their currency, and it is an open assembly where everything gets used. So our last question is, how can we regulate it democratically and not only through the financial market thing?
Thank you so much. And we talked a lot about the difference between post-secularism and atheism, and what the religious or post-religious import of currencies in general are. We talked a lot about the meaning of anarchism. What is the archon in anarchism? Who has the archive? What is the concept of anarchism that anarcho-capitalism favors? Who is the ruler that is to be avoided? In what way is that merely a reduction of rulership to individuals, or systems governed by sentient and conscious beings? The relationship of the infinite regress figure that I tried to present, and Hofstadter's book Gödel, Escher, Bach, which I think is like tracing that figure to right, this question of post-secularism, atheism, and then I think maybe as a last question from this discussion, I would like to repeat a question that we asked, which is: has an atheist anarchism even be thought, or is the anarchism even perpetrated in the initial models regarding cryptocurrencies bound up with post-religious figures? These were questions that came up. I'm really grateful for everybody who discussed with us. I'm really grateful to Rose and Dennis who launched this little adventure of thought together with me. I'm really grateful for everybody who facilitated. I'm really grateful for the live streaming. I'm really grateful for the venue. I want to thank everybody who's involved. I want to invite everybody to go and have drinks with us and continue discussing. You can, of course, stay in touch, get our contact data if fancy, emancipatory, revolutionary, whatever kinds of projects could evolve from this. That'd be pretty nice. It would be pretty nice if we could leave the boundaries, the frontiers of the cultural left, and get a little bit into movement, do things on the ground. Not just think and talk and be fancy and accumulate more cultural and social capital and reinvest it in other discussions where we now have acquired lots of cultural capital and cryptocurrencies, which is a hot topic right now, so we can be hotter on the market of attraction and market ourselves on a market of being hired and jobs, etc., etc. It's not that I don't know why you're here. But of course, the real joke would be to and slash the government and abolish the money system, all property, etc., etc. Talk on and wherever we'll be. Thank you. Applause for everybody.